From Wana Brands, welcome to Enhance Your Life. I'm your host, Jonathan Small, and each week I talk to people from all sorts of professions and backgrounds about how cannabis has enhanced their lives and how this healing plant can enrich your life too. Hey everybody, welcome to the Enhance Your Life podcast. My name is Jonathan Small and I am your host, and I am delighted to bring you my guest today, Heather Cabot. Heather is the author of a terrific new book called The New Chardonnay, The Unlikely Story of How Marijuana Went Mainstream. And Heather is also an award-winning journalist. She's a podcaster, a keynote speaker, and a former ABC News correspondent, an anchor. Dun, 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 dun. She is a married mother of teen twins, and she resides with her family outside New York City. Heather, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the origin story of this book, because it's not, you are not maybe a likely candidate to write a book like this. You know, coming from the mainstream media and covering tech very extensively in your career, certainly before you wrote this book. Tell me how you decided to write a book about marijuana.
Well, first I'll just say, some people might say I'm the last person.
I was being kind.
Literally the last person to ever write a book about cannabis. But actually, so the idea for the book really grew out of my reporting on my previous book, Geek Girl Rising, which was about women across the tech ecosystem advocating for a seat at the table. And in that book, there was a chapter about women funding women-led tech startups. And I had spent a good deal of time getting to know a number of leaders in that space. And right around the time that Geek Girl Rising was coming out, it was May of 2017, I noticed that some of those same women were starting to invest in cannabis companies. And I really didn't know anything about the space at all. But I just thought, this is interesting. Why are they investing in this? It's still federally illegal. Isn't that risky? And these are people who have Wall Street credentials, Ivy League pedigrees, like very straight laced. Like I just thought, why would they want to do this? And so I started, like any reporter, just working the phones because I'm old fashioned and that's how I do things. And so I called people, and I called some of the, one of the first people that I had a chance to speak with was Jean Sullivan, who's, and I'm sure your listeners know, is one of the earliest women and earliest people, honestly, investing in ancillary businesses in the cannabis industry. And she said, I don't think that I can explain to you what's happening in cannabis in one phone call. If you really want to do this story, you need to go to MJ-BizCon. You need to go to Las Vegas, spend a week at the convention, walk the expo floor, see what's going on, because there is so much happening that the mainstream really doesn't understand at all. And she said, I think that you're going to find some really interesting insights there. And so that's what I did. Yeah. And I was in the middle of the book tour actually for Geek Girl Rising. And in the middle, I decided to go to Las Vegas. And I remember telling my parents that I was doing this. And I'm like almost 50 years old. And they were still like, oh, is this going to be safe? Are you going to be okay? Like, we don't know about this. And my husband was, he thought it was funny that I was interested in this, but he also knew that, after speaking with me, and, he's a former journalist as well, like he knew that there could be a really fascinating story there. So he was like, go for it. So that's how it all started. And for those who might not be familiar, so the MJ-BizCon is this huge convention that happens in Vegas. It was happening before the pandemic hit, and hopefully it'll come back. And I think it happens in December or November. And it's like the Consumer Electronics Show. It's quite impressive. Like, you have no idea until you go to this show what a big business cannabis is and how legit it really is. And like you said, it's not people in tie-dye shirts and stoners outside. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of that there, which is fine because that's the OG anyway. But it is really new. It's really like capitalism at work. It's all these people trying to establish themselves, right? I mean, that's a great way to frame it. I mean, and I had been to the Consumer Electronics Show covering tech multiple times. And it was funny, the year that I went, which was the fall of 2017, the convention had actually just moved to the Las Vegas Convention Center, which is where CES is held. And it was a very big deal in terms of legitimizing the industry that they could fill a conference like that at the Vegas Convention Center. And it was absolutely legit. I mean, it was everything you would expect at a trade show, as I write in the book, everything from people carrying their little swag bags and, their lanyards with their name tags and, lots of guys in sport coats. And I mean, it really was, I went to my first day, I went to the crash course on weed, and I was sitting there with, lots of people like me that didn't know anything about this industry and were really there to learn everything from the science to the business.
And so you decide to tell this story in many different voices through the sort of eyes of different characters in the business, some of whom have been on this podcast. Jeff, the cannabis chef, the 420 cannabis chef was on recently, and we've had a few others, and I've certainly covered them in my other job at Green Entrepreneur. So I was actually kind of relieved to know that I'm certainly on the right track here. But why did you decide to take that approach, and how did you pick the people that you decided to pick?
Well, first of all, I think that as a storyteller, I think the first thing you always want to look for are great characters, especially when you're telling a very complicated and controversial story. I mean, there are lots of aspects to the cannabis space, and I wanted to find people that I felt like my audience could relate to on a very human level. And I wanted people who I also, in the course of following them over several years, I wanted to have characters that all had sort of a real natural narrative arc. So every single person in the book, these four main characters, they all sort of have a beginning, middle, and end. I didn't know what their ending was going to be while I was reporting it out. But when I finally sat down to say, okay, who are my main people going to be? They really had to be the people that I knew I'd be able to sort of interconnect their stories, but also to be able to hit on different aspects of cannabis, because I'm writing for that lay audience. I'm writing for the person that maybe isn't a consumer, maybe even is somebody that never thought they would be interested in it. And then all of a sudden now they're seeing Martha Stewart and Gwyneth Paltrow, and, they're looking at all these luxury products and CBD for sleep and, all these things they never thought about before. So I'm writing for those people. And as you know, and as your listeners probably know, I mean, it is a very complicated topic. I mean, everything from the science, the medical side of things, to obviously the political landscape. So I wanted to find people who could put a face on some, or who's through their stories, I could touch on the history, or touch on the controversy, or touch on research or regulation or various things that were happening in real time, frankly, as I was reporting the book. I mean, that was the other part of it that was challenging, was reporting it while it's on fire. I mean, it was on fire those years that I was it was 2018 when I was doing most of the reporting.
And some people didn't want to talk to you, right? A few people were very secretive about it.
I would say the main people that did not want to talk to me, ultimately it's come to light since the book was published, sort of why they probably didn't want me, sort of behind the scenes with them, because they've, lots of allegations of not great stuff happening within their companies. So
right.
There were people that I seemed like obvious. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, but
yes.
there were certain entrepreneurs that I was like, oh, that's a great character. And I had multiple meetings with these founders and thought that they were going to sign on to the project and let me be a fly on the wall, and things happened. And that's okay. I mean, really, this type of reporting, as you know, I mean, it really requires cultivating a level of trust with your sources, because you're spending, it can be a very secretive business. It's super competitive. And, for one of the main characters, Beth Stavola, her whole company is very much run it's a family business.
Yeah, let's talk about Beth. She's fascinating. So she's a New Jersey mom of 5 or 6, right? Jersey Shore. I've written about her and Green Entrepreneur, but the last person in the world that you would think would start a cannabis company. She's like a mom, suburban mom. Tell us a little bit about her story without giving too much away, because people should read your book. But tell us a little bit about her story.
Thank you. Well, yeah, and her story has a lot of suspense. Beth as you said, I mean, she was a suburban mom of 6. The thing about Beth, and the reason why I think I really gravitated to her story, not only because she's an unexpected person to go into this. I mean, she worked on Wall Street for many years, and she really, worked at a time when there were not a lot of women on Wall Street, and really cut her teeth there. And that certainly came in handy as she got into the business and was really kind of dealing with the cutthroat nature of things. I love that her story is sort of a story of redemption. Here's this woman that got off this career track that she loved because she had some pressure from her husband to stay home with her kids. And by chance, she got into the industry at a very fortuitous time in Arizona. And even though she has some bumps in the road, which I reveal in the book, and even encounters danger, she stays in it and proves everyone wrong, I think, in a lot of ways. And I love that about her. I love the fact that she's not who you would think would be in this industry, and everyone underestimates her. Everyone underestimates her. So
I know you're quite interested in sort of the social equity aspect of the business. Talk about, maybe some of the people that you followed in your book and that you followed in your just reporting. Maybe step back and explain a little bit what's going on in terms of that issue in the industry, and then who are some of the people that you decide to report on, and what are their stories?
Well, I mean, I think, again, coming in as an outsider, and I will say I did not really understand the relationship between the war on drugs and systemic racism in this country. I mean, I've been a reporter for a long time, but I really had not covered it in that way. I didn't know about the statistics. I didn't realize, how many more times, I think it's like almost 4 more times that Black and brown people are arrested compared to white people. And that's still true today, even with legalization, I believe, which is really unfortunate. And we have a problem in this country with biased policing, and the war on drugs was used as a tool in a lot of these communities to put people behind bars and ruin lives. And so as I'm reporting on the commercialization and sort of this, capitalism on steroids of what's happening in, the green rush, at the same time, you have people who are still serving time, or people who have these low-level offenses that are on their records, these felonies, and they're not allowed to vote. They have trouble getting housing. They have trouble getting jobs. Oh, and by the way, in some of the states where this is happening, I mean, Colorado is a perfect example, and I write about this in the book. Nothing was done to help them when they legalized cannabis back in the day. There was nothing in that program that enabled the governor to wipe clean those records. So those people were not even allowed to participate in the industry, even when they had been arrested and convicted for being involved in it when it was illicit. So that was something, that hypocrisy really, I have to say, it haunted me. It haunted me as I'm reporting on these people who are making gobs and gobs of money, and yet there are people who are just so disproportionately left out from what's happening in the industry and are suffering. So how I sort of come at that in the book is I talk about the genesis of legalization in Colorado, and the fact that wasn't part of the original program there. And readers will meet a character named Wanda James, who I know you are familiar with.
Yeah.
She, for your listeners, Wanda and her husband were the first African-Americans in the US to have a dispensary license. They've become very, very vocal advocates for racial justice and social equity in the industry, and very successful entrepreneurs. And so Wanda was one of the pioneers in Colorado that got Amendment 64 passed. And so I talk about her passion for it and why she was so passionate about the industry. And the reason why is because she has a brother who served time 11 years for a low-level possession in Texas. And at one point during his sentence, he was forced to pick cotton to work off. I mean, this is like, and this is happening in the 90s. I mean, this is
crazy.
It's really,
people still pick cotton.
Really upsetting.
Yeah.
It's really disturbing. And then he gets out, and he's not allowed to participate in her business in Colorado because he has a felony. on his record. And I should say Colorado remedied that this summer, and the legislature there passed a piece of legislation now that allows the governor to pardon low-level offenses, and they're creating these new so-called social equity programs, which allow people from brown and black communities and people who are in certain low-income zip codes, et cetera, to be able to get priority when they apply to be part of the industry. Still a lot of problems with that, and we haven't really seen, and you and I have talked about this in other states, it hasn't worked as well as I think a lot of the idealists had hoped. We'll see what happens in New York and New Jersey and some other places, but it's a problem. So it is something that I get at in the book through Wanda's story, even through Snoop Dogg's story, you know, and why he and his business partner, Ted Chung, and Ted is one of the other main characters in the book. He's Snoop Dogg's partner and longtime business manager. And I talk about one of the, and I think show people what really motivated them to get into the industry. And it wasn't only about making money. It was also about remedying some of these injustices and empowering disenfranchised groups to profit off this industry.
And now we see Jay-Z coming in and also, you know, starting lots of social equity programs and or a large $10 million fund to help people of color get into the business. You had mentioned Wanda, you know, she had a personal story attachment to, you know, a certain issue within the cannabis industry. One thing I found in reporting about this business is so many people get into the business for a personal reason, probably more than any other business I've ever covered. Did you find that the same too? Like everybody has a story. Oh, my father was, you know, suffering from cancer and this helped him relieve the pain, or I fell off a bike and broke my back, and cannabis. I feel like so many people come to it with a personal attachment to the plant in some way. Did you find that as well? And it's an interesting dynamic of, I think, of this industry.
Yeah, I did find that. I mean, obviously, I did meet people that really were getting in because they wanted to cash in.
Yeah.
But and a lot of those people. But and again, that kind of leads to the sort of the unexpected aspect of the characters in the book. I mean, one of the people in Beth's story is Mel McDonald, who's a former U.S. attorney in Arizona who used to, you know, go after the drug cartels, and he ends up, you know, I don't want to give away too much, but he ends up becoming a big figure in her life and an advocate for her. I mean, he's, you know, an elder in the Church of Latter-day Saints. I mean, and you would never think that he would ever be involved with the industry at all. But that's sort of the Alice in Wonderland nature, I think, of this landscape and what really drew me to it, especially because, you know, cannabis is still highly stigmatized and was for so many years. I mean, I grew up in the Just Say No generation. Absolutely. You know, and this was not something that, it was very taboo. And I think there are a lot of people that grew up that way and then they stumble into it, like you said, because somebody has cancer, somebody, you know, they have a relative that is suffering from Parkinson's, or, you know, has some, I think most of the time, you know, it's people who are coming at it from the medical entry point. And I think that it opens their minds to the idea that there's something there. So yeah, there's a lot of passion that I encountered, certainly.
So you call the book The New Chardonnay. Why did you choose to call it that? Because I've heard that analogy before. I'm curious to find out how you thought of it, The New Chardonnay.
The first time that I really thought about it was when I met Ted Chung for the first time.
Okay.
And when we were talking, he was trying to explain to me about this new market and the new market that he and Snoop envisioned that cannabis products would be reaching in the future. And he said it was Chardonnay moms. And I thought, well, that's my demographic, right? I'm a Chardonnay mom. I'm a suburban mom of teenagers. And I thought that was very interesting. Then, of course, when I went up to Smiths Falls to the Hershey factory and I met Bruce Linton, the founder of Canopy Growth, who, as people will find out if they read the book, you know, he started this massive cannabis company inside an old Hershey's factory. And it was his dream at the time, during the time that I was following him, to create the cannabis beverage of the future. And again, it was this idea that it will be targeted at the canna curious, the people who were interested in something that was light and refreshing and would help you relax, but, you know, not leave you couch locked. So there was that. And then the last piece of it was when I learned that in Colorado, how they marketed Proposition 64 to voters was they were comparing the merits of cannabis to the detriments of alcohol. And I thought that was so interesting in Coors country, to use that as a way to sell it to voters. That, and of course, repairing crumbling schools. But the the idea of bringing alcohol into the conversation was novel at that time. And so there were those three things. I felt they just were very thematic, and I felt like that was something that maybe my reader hadn't thought about.
How much is this idea of it being the new Chardonnay sort of marketing hype? And I mean, it sounds great and it makes great copy for a story. Like, this is the new Chardonnay. Like, this is what, moms all over America, instead, they don't want to drink and get the hangover. They want the social high. I mean, there's so many brands, Bebo and Candescent and sort of luxury brands. You mentioned Lord Jim. Is that Lord
James?
Lord James. Luxury, kind of the Goop type brands, and this idea. How much of that, though, is hype, and how much of that do you get the sense is true, or is it just too soon to tell because it's we're not federally legal yet?
Yeah, well, I think the federally legal piece of it is key because you're not seeing national brands really. They're not able to build national brands because there's no national supply chain. I think a lot of it is marketing. The jacket copy of my book talks about the rebranding of cannabis. And I believe that is what my book is about.
Yep.
It is very much about marketing, but I think it's also about the fact that, and this was actually a conversation that I had when I visited WANA, when I spoke with Nancy Whiteman, which was the fact that the real winners in the future will be the companies that figure out the consistent dosing. Because right now it's still so new. And of course, again, you don't have these big national supply chains and companies able to really grow at scale, at least in the US. And you don't have the R&D. I think that we really would need to be able to promise to consumers that every time that you have this particular thing, that it's going to feel the exact same way. I think we're not. And I don't know every single brand out there, but I think that in general, I'm making a generalization. I think that it's hard to guarantee what the experience is going to be. But I think in the future, the brands that win will be the ones that do, because I think one of the big things that consumers have to get over, first of all, there's a lot of education about all these new products out there and what they do and how they make you feel and how long they last and all of that. So I think it is a little bit of hype right now. On the other hand, though, I will say that I think there is a focus on the part of these companies to try to create products that are products that you would feel comfortable integrating into your lifestyle, like a glass of wine. So I think there is certainly a focus on that. And I think as we progress, as the country progresses and more states come online, and we'll see what happens at the federal level, I think that's where it's going. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it totally does. I mean, it's fascinating. I think it's a little soon to tell, and maybe it's not. I mean, it's a nice sort of fantasy at this point to imagine that it's that it could be like a Chardonnay in the table of every after work suburban household. But I mean, there's so many obstacles in the way, and one of those obstacles being education, and everybody's had that bad experience with the pot brownie in college, or not everybody, but I certainly had. And I think people are terrified. The canna curious we're talking about, there's sort of two groups here. There's the canna curious, and then there's the people who are just, longtime users.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think people have all been at a party where they've seen that, the problem is it's the person that, or if it's not you yourself, you've witnessed somebody who's like, oh, I'll just have another square of chocolate, and so these companies really, they have a long way to go to educating consumers on how to use these products. I think it will come. I think it will come, but I agree with you. I don't think we're there yet. And so it was funny because the new Chardonnay, I called it that because I felt like that is where the marketing is. Mm-hmm. But I'm not necessarily saying that it is the new Chardonnay yet.
The person who told me that word was Adam Bierman from MedMen.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And, look where he is now. But I think it is. I think it's good. I think it's certainly a positive goal. Where do you see this all going? I mean, do you think we are on the precipice of federal legalization, or is it going to be a slow kind of roll state by state by state? you're on top of things. Like what's your predictions here?
So I'm not as plugged in on the Hill as I was a few months ago, but I will say that I think the states are going to continue to lead the way. In terms of today, I think the states are going to continue, it's going to be state by state, and that's how it's going to go, at least in the short term. I mean, we're coming out of a pandemic, rebuilding from this terrible economic downturn. I mean, there's a lot happening for dealing with systemic racism. I mean, there's a lot happening for this new administration. What I do think is I get the sense that there is still a lot of discussion about safe banking, the Safe Banking Act, which essentially, for your viewers, you may not realize this, but like most cannabis businesses in this country, they don't have access to banking because it's federally illegal. So it's a cash business.
Right. It's crazy. People are driving armored cars from their dispensaries to their, I mean, it's very unsafe. Yeah.
It's very unsafe. And it's also, it creates a lot of hurdles for, this goes back to the social equity piece. It creates a lot of hurdles for people who are not independently wealthy or who don't have big networks of wealthy friends.
Can't get a loan. Yeah.
Business. Yeah, because you can't get a loan. And so that's a problem. So I do think that before we see, a total, descheduling, I think my sense is that Congress will take up the banking issue first, because you said it, I mean, it is a safety issue for communities. When you are dealing with a business that you don't have banking, you can't deposit, you're dealing with, like, I think you said armored trucks. And I mean, it's not safe for communities, not let alone the dispensaries. So I think there's that. And I also think, all of these different interesting advances in software and all of that, I think that's going to continue to fuel the industry. And I think we're going to see incremental growth at the state level and lots of interesting things happening from a technology point of view. I don't have a crystal ball as far as like when, when I think federally things will change. The fact that we're having a conversation about systemic racism in this country, that I do think does bode well for the conversation to continue in terms of putting it in the context of the war on drugs and repairing the harms of the war on drugs. Because certainly in the years that I've been reporting on this, that conversation has really only started to emerge at the national level in the last 2 years. You wouldn't hear people tweeting about this or writing about this in the context of putting it in a racial context in the way you have recently. And I think that's, I think there's a lot of momentum around that.
Well, it is a fascinating topic, one that I think we're both, so interested in and have spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about. So I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. I very much recommend this book to our listeners. And Heather, if people want to find out more about you, where should they go?
They can go to my website, heathercabot.com, and I'm on Instagram at heather.cabot. And I was just going to say also, even though I love to, my husband always says that I'm kind of a wonk and I love to talk about the inside baseball, and I know you do too, but I will say that the New Chardonnay is very much written like a novel. And
yes.
Heading into summer, I hope you'll agree that,
yes.
It's kind of a beach read. I mean, it's a fast read. Which is why I wanted to choose these really fun characters is, you learn a lot about the industry, but it's also, I think, kind of a fun ride with these 4 unexpected people. So
your journalistic skills and storytelling skills definitely shine through in it. And I read a lot of dry cannabis books and articles, and this is definitely not one of them. So yes, that's why I wanted to have you on the show.
Yay. Thank you so much.
All right, Heather, we'll have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you too. Take care.
Thanks, Heather.
Enhance Your Life is brought to you by Wana, the #1 infused product in the U.S. Wana's entire process is designed to deliver the same great experience time after time. They have spent years fine-tuning their recipes so that their products are delicious, consistent, and potent. For more information, check out wanawellness.com. That's Wana, W-A-N-A, wellness.com.